Hello and welcome back to HEMAFightBreakdowns. Today I'm going to be breaking down the gold medal match between Rashelle, Debolt, and Brittany Reeves for the URG Saber finals. Now this was a really cool match that was featured on the main live stream for the finals, and also as a little bit of a difference, we are going to be looking at the second round of 3 fights between these two fighters. If you don't know, at Socal Sword Fight 2025, when you were in the finals, aka the gold medal match, you didn't just fight your opponent one time to a certain point limit and time limit, you fought them 3 times, and then the winner of the best of those 3 fights was the one who won overall and got the gold medal. So we're going to be looking at the second fight here. The reason for that is that the first one was a little bit uneventful, and in my opinion, the second one is the one where all the really cool adaptations were happening and where a lot of the game plans that both of these fighters had really came into play and paid off. Now, our first exchange is actually pretty complicated, and this is one of the results of doing the first exchange of the second set of the second fight, because at the end of the day, both of these fighters already have an idea of what the other one is going for, so there isn't that normal feeling out period. And what happens here is that we see fighter on the right go in for a feinted attack, feinting on the right side and then coming down on the left side, and the defender on the left here just throwing up that very basic roof parry, that top of the line parry that is so very common in Saber. But the first thing I want to point out here is that one of the reasons that you might do this parry, as opposed to any other kind of more traditional, maybe Olympic fencing 2 or 4 style parry, is primarily because of the weapons that are being used here. You probably noticed already, but both of these fencers are using much more Polish saber style sabers, meaning that they do not have a lot of hand protection and they have a very steep curve to them. And the reason that this top parry is so useful in this particular interaction is because, one, it keeps the dominant hand kind of pulled back and out of the way, which takes it away as a target, and 2, it helps deal with the fact that the curve of the saber results in you not having so much of a weak part of your sword to parry with. Now, normally, parrying with the weak of your sword is pretty much always a bad idea, as if you parry a blow that is done with the strong or the middle of a sword, regardless of how it's shaped, you're probably not going to have the kind of structure you need. However, with lighter one-handed weapons, you can sometimes get away with things like this, but with a very heavily curved Polish saber, you do not really have a weak of your blade anymore, and if you try to parry with it, the blow is going to slide straight down the curve of your sword and into its target. So, these really big ceiling parries are very, very useful for not just parrying with the strong of the blade, where is the only place you're going to get leverage, but also making sure that you are keeping your hand back, like I already said, and making sure that the curve of the saber draws your opponent's blade from the contact point into the crossguard, if you can call it that, and making sure that you have full control over those parries. This is really important for the defender here and fencer on the left, because one of the game plans that we're going to see executed throughout this entire fight is whether or not that first bit of defense holds. Fencer on the right loves to come in with very heavy, very precise, and very fast attacks in the opening action, and whether or not they get parried often determines whether or not the exchange goes to one person's favor or the other. Now, in this very particular exchange, that initial attack happens, the clash happens, and then they kind of just separate a little bit. You can see in the slow-mo that fencer on the left tries to do a little bit of a plunging cut with their blade, but it kind of just flat slaps their opponent on the top of the head. In my opinion, this really happened as a accidental consequence of trying to make sure that they zoned their opponent's blade all the way off to the side, and in the process of doing that, ended up dropping their tip and just doing that kind of flat slappy motion. But what happens after that is that the fencer on the right here goes in with a very ballistic thrust. And another thing to pay attention to here when it comes to the weapons is that thrusting with a Polish saber requires you to basically have your hand offline so that your tip can curve in and reach its target. It also means that thrusts from a Polish saber are going to be a little bit shorter, but they're also going to be a little bit harder to defend, especially if your method of defending them is to try to sweep them from down to up or up to down, because that pointed curved tip is going to now get pushed into some other kind of target, as well as you're going to be trying to engage with what is more than likely the middle of the blade rather than the tip of the blade. Lucky for the defender here on the left side, they go for a sweeping parry from left to right and look to just barely, if not quite, make it to pushing that thrust all the way offline, that so it just grazes the side of their face, and then they return with a middle cut along to the body. Now, this, as I said, again, going to be something that we see a lot played out throughout this fight. But the adaptations that come are all going to be based around this very basic paradigm. Basically, every single exchange you're going to see is one where Fencer on the right engages, Fencer on the left defends, and throws a counterattack. And what happens throughout this fight is always going to be one of these fencers either trying to improve their defense, improve their offense, or improve what kind of action they take in the afterblow or the counter cut. So for our first adaptation, we see a change in the tactics of the fencer on the left, the one who, for the most part, always is in the defensive posture. And in a sense, they stay to that defensive posture, but they make a couple of key adjustments that is very important to the success of the final exchange at the very end of the clip. One thing that they make the change of is that every single time the fencer on the right has come forward with a big ballistic cut or thrust, they have had a little bit of a windup. And paying attention to that windup means that you can start doing stop cuts and stop thrusts. So fencer on the left recognizes that their opponent is always winding up a little bit before they charge at them, and so they are throwing these cuts horizontally towards the face of their opponent, really not in the sense that they want to really land them, but so that if their opponent chooses that moment to leap into action, they're going to inadvertently run themselves onto the point or onto the blade of their opponent's sword. So this is a really, really good idea to try to stifle the offense of your opponent. By constantly throwing your blade out there, you're making sure that your opponent is going to second guess every time they try to spring into action, because they don't simply want to throw themselves onto the tip of a sword and then land their action in what would inevitably be an afterblow. So now that fencer on the left has stifled the offense of fencer on the right, we are looking more into getting this parry-riposte style response going. Now that fencer on the right is a little bit more hesitant about how quickly and how suddenly they come into action, it makes their initial attack that little bit more predictable. So when they do finally leap in, they get easily parried and riposted to the head by fencer on the left. But there is another little factor to consider here, and that is that the response cut that fencer on the left is constantly throwing here is in a little bit of a strange position. One thing you'll notice is that every time they throw this left cut across the middle towards the head, they lean their torso towards their left side to almost a 90-degree angle. And the reason that they're doing this is primarily because what they believe to be happening is that their opponent is throwing a 45-degree angle cut from their top right quadrant to their bottom left quadrant. And this makes a nice little line across their torso. If you angle your body towards the level of that incoming cut, you theoretically give yourself a situation where, because your cut is coming across horizontally, it's zoning out your left side, so you want to move your body towards your own cut so that your blade can do a better job of protecting you from any angle that is coming in from that position. However, the result of this body lean is that she is also sometimes throwing her cuts very, very flat. And this is one such instance where the counter cut that she throws does a really good job of protecting her, and her lean definitely contributes to not getting hit. It also means that when she ends up in her final position, her wrist is completely supinated with her thumb facing down, and the flat of the blade is what strikes her opponent, resulting in her not getting any points. Now, for this next exchange, we see the inklings of an adaptation, but one that doesn't quite pay off, and another application and another camera angle of really the previous adaptation. So one thing that you start to see is that fighter on the right, who is now on the left, thanks to the switch of the camera angle, is starting to probe for hand shots. Now, in an instance where your opponent is throwing out shots that are not really threatening unless you run yourself onto them, one of the big disadvantages to doing actions like that is that you expose your hand. By moving your hand further forward, you are lowering your guard essentially on one side or another and leaving yourself open to getting hand sniped. So, by taking a step forward, fencer now on the left is basically looking to provoke that defensive action with the throwing of those horizontal cuts, and then looking to try to snipe the hand. Unfortunately, this doesn't quite work out, because despite the fact that she predicted this interaction perfectly, the cut that she throws to the hand actually accidentally goes under the hand of her opponent as her opponent raises up her hands to throw that follow-up cut. So she ends up whiffing her own hand strike, and in my opinion, the defensive fighter, who is again now on the right, does a pretty good job of recognizing that her opponent has missed a cut and throws a follow-up cut of her own, which actually seems to land pretty meaningfully onto the arm, but for some reason the judges don't call it. After this interaction, we see another repeated interaction of what we saw in the previous exchange. Fencer on the left comes in with a really aggressive cut. Fencer on the right parries it with this sweeping, high-ceiling parry, and then comes around onto the left side towards the head. And this time, they seem to get a lot more blade contact than they did before. You also get a much better angle that can show you exactly why this little bit of a lean to the left and a push to the right can be so effective at dispelling any counterattacking action. You can clearly see Fencer on the left, after they get their first initial attack parried, is trying to go for follow-ups, but is completely unable to get their feet and their hands in the proper position because the amount of pressure that is going into their head and into their blade from their right side is so overwhelming that they end up getting kind of pushed off to the side and olayed past their own body. So they're unable to really do a meaningful follow-up, and this time the Fencer with the defensive countercut does manage to get some points. Now, I mentioned in the previous exchange that there was an attempt at an adaptation here, and this is the exchange where we finally see it pay off. The Fencer, again on the left, who has been the aggressor for pretty much every single one of these exchanges, is noticing that they need to be able to take advantage of their entry action, but they are finding that their entry actions are often getting parried by big, heavy ceiling parries from their opponent. So, as a result, instead of going forward and throwing that big attack as they have done before, they go forward and they throw a much smaller and much less committed hand shot. The idea being is that if you spend all of your time sweeping your hand up into a defensive posture, your arm is going to be exposed throughout the entire process, and you're very likely to get hit, and most importantly, you're very likely not to get hit back at the same time. So she goes in, she feints an attack high, pivots, and throws a hand shot that it looks like an undercut towards the bottom of the arm, and it does look like it lands. However, a very good amount of credit needs to be given to the defensive fighter here, who instantly recognizes that they have been feinted and that someone is probably going for a hand shot and throws a hand shot of their own as an afterblow. This is important to consider because one of the key parts of landing a cheeky little hand snipe is that you need to be able to get in and get out. In most rule sets, including this one, landing a hand shot and then getting afterblowed generally results in you either getting no points and sometimes results in your opponent getting points depending on where they hit you. So it's really, really important that if you're going to go for this tactic, you need to have a very solid game plan for getting out as soon as you get in. And the problem with the particular hand cut that Fencer on the left chose to throw is that it is an undercut that leaves the bottom part of their hand pretty much undefended. Not undefended in the ending position that they end their cut in, but undefended in the sense that immediately after they throw this undercut, they pivot back to where they feel comfortable, which is with their blade facing upwards. And that pivot, that rotation from their blade being down to their blade being up, is exactly where their vulnerability lied, and exactly the vulnerability that the defensive fighter on the right capitalized on. Now, so far in this fight, the Fencer, who has been defensive, has been pretty much trying to figure out when their opponent is going to attack, and then trying to get that parry-riposte action that they've been pretty successful with so far. But this next exchange and this next adaptation comes on the part of them becoming significantly more aggressive. And in my opinion, this is a really, really smart adaptation. Not only because it capitalizes on the fact that their opponent might have been getting very used to their defensive posture, but also because it accentuates an adaptation that they made earlier in terms of trying to shut down their opponent's offense. What we have seen is that the Fencer on the left for the majority of the clip, they're on the right for a little bit in the beginning, has started to move forward and throw much more committed cuts towards the head of their opponent. And the reaction that they get is actually very similar to the reaction that they were getting when they were throwing much more defensive, much less committed cuts towards the head that they really seemed to think that their opponent was just going to throw themselves onto. Since, to this point, their opponent has never once thrown themselves onto a tip, it is actually a really smart idea to start getting more defensive, because what you know, based on your previous experience and your previous adaptation, is that your your opponent does in fact respond to your aggression by becoming defensive. It is therefore a really smart idea to start becoming more and more and more aggressive, because not only can you force them into a defensive posture from which you can start doing whatever you want, but also because you know that you are able to successfully shut down their offense with a little bit of offense of your own. And it's that moment of hesitation when they think their opponent is coming for them that results in another classic parry-riposte combination that the previously defensive fencer is clearly so keen to set up. The interaction that we see here is one, again, where the defensive fighter is now being aggressive. They're going forward. They're throwing these attacks. They're getting in a little bit closer every single time. But what's important is that the fencer on the right is shooting themselves backwards every time they think their opponent's coming in. And what happens here towards the end is that the fencer on the left goes in for a big cut, same as they've done previously before. They wait for that parry, that bind in the middle, and then they immediately pivot off of it and go for that left counter cut. The exact same counter cut that they have been normally doing off of a parry, they now initiated off of an attack of their own. And the reason they knew that they would be safe to do this is because they knew that every time they have gone forward, their opponent simply went backwards and tried to parry. So if you throw out a essentially fake cut that's not intending to land, let it get parried, and then immediately pivot off of that contact and go along to the opposite side, you can easily trick your opponent into putting up the wrong kind of defense. And because they know that they're going to be defensive, they know that they're not just going to hit them in the head on the way in at the exact same time. So at this point, fencer on the left has been showing a lot of dominance in the fight in their ability to set up and pay off their favorite kind of motion, which is namely a ceiling parry into a left side counter cut. And it's been working for them pretty much every time, although sometimes they have landed with the flat and not with the blade. The real important thing to take away here is that every single time fencer on the right has charged in and thrown an attack, they were unsuccessful and they were unable to get past this parry. However, the only points that they've gotten up till now are ones in which they have thrown hand shots. And this is an important thing to know, because at this point, they are going back to the hand shots that they were successful at, but the fencer on the left seems to have predicted this adaptation. And so, rather than throwing the parries that they have been throwing up to now, and even rather than throwing the larger, more committed cuts to the head that they threw in the previous exchange, the fencer on the left goes for the exact same cut combination where they kind of drift through their ceiling parry for a moment and then throw their hand shot at the exact same time as their opponent is throwing their own hand shot. Now, in this particular interaction, we get a little bit of line judge interruption, but at the same time, you can sort of see what happens through the footage, and it looks like both fencers either hit each other in the hand or that one fencer just managed to get a slightly better cut to the hand. It's not really important, in my opinion, who manages to get the points out of this exchange, though, because it sets up the adaptations that we have seen previously, and most importantly, it sets up the critical adaptation that happens in the next and final exchange. So coming up now is the final exchange, and my favorite adaptation in the fight. One thing that we've seen throughout this entire fight is fencer on the left throwing up these ceiling parries and throwing those counter left shots and being pretty successful with it. And so far, fencer on the right has not been able to crash through that parry or throw anything in their initial action that has been able to capitalize on that reaction that they know is coming. But this time they do something different, and they do something critically different that helps counteract that position and cut that their opponent puts themselves in when they throw their favorite technique. So what fencer on the right here does is they come forward with a thrust on the upper right side, and they do it with their hand fairly retracted, though they do obviously push it out there to try to land the thrust. This is a good idea for two reasons. One is that the ceiling parry that their opponent does isn't going to be the best possible parry for getting that thrust out of the way. However, it does still manage to make it there, and it does successfully parry. But the second thing that makes this right-sided thrust so smart is that it stands directly in the path of the counter left cut that fencer on the left has thrown every single time. And because they throw it again, they are getting interrupted and stuffed by the presence of the blade of fencer on the right, who has kept it there throughout the execution of their thrust. At this point, the lean and the counter left cut that fencer on the left loves to use is now putting them in a really, really bad position. They are leaning to their left, which normally was a benefit because it allowed them to get behind their blade, but now they are not behind anything at all. and the fencer on the right pulls their backhand into measure and grabs the sword arm of their opponent. Now, in a one-handed sword fight, grabbing the sword arm of your opponent with your non-dominant hand is pretty much the most dominant position you can be in. But in a lot of ways, the ways that this was set up happened and worked because that the fencer on the right knew exactly what was going to happen. So they did exactly what they needed to do. They got their opponent into their compromised position. They got control of their sword arm. And as a result, they get the cleanest possible 3-point interaction. And this was a really key exchange because up until now, fencer on the right had been down on points and really needed a critical exchange in order to pull it back. So to do so at the final exchange is not only exciting, but a really great demonstration that if you learn from your opponent throughout your fight, there's always something that you can pull off at the end, right when it matters most. It might have been that the fencer on the right could have tried this technique earlier on, but wasn't necessarily confident that it was going to work out this way. And as such, they only managed to pull it out right at the last point because that was the point where they had nothing left to lose. This is the point where you have to pull out all the stops. You have to go for that risky technique. And in this case, it really paid off and it really looked pretty. So that is going to be it for this particular fight. Obviously, they have 2 other fights that you can watch on the Socal Sword Fight streaming network or channel, whatever the hell you want to call it. And hopefully you enjoyed watching this breakdown. So if you want to see more of this, I'm pretty much out of Socal now, so I'm going to have to start moving to other things next week. But if you'd like to see that, I will be there, and I will have more for you to watch.